As we initiate our autopsy of 1408, we must first establish the fundamental baseline of our protagonist, Mike Enslin, a man whose entire psychological and economic framework is built upon the aggressive short-selling of hope and spirituality. Enslin operates within a highly specific, cynical niche of the literary market, functioning as a ghost hunter who has completely divested from the concept of the supernatural, monetizing the absence of the paranormal to fund a life of profound emotional isolation. The opening sequence at a dreary bed and breakfast serves as a brilliant proof of concept for his business model. We witness him mechanically extracting local folklore, filtering it through his proprietary brand of skepticism, and converting it into easily digestible, low-tier consumer paperbacks. He approaches these haunted locations not with the curiosity of an investigator, but with the weary detachment of a corporate auditor, utilizing a grading system, represented by his 10-skull rating, to assign arbitrary value to non-existent threats. This transactional relationship with the unknown highlights his severe emotional bankruptcy. He is a man who treats trauma, both historical and personal, as a depreciating asset to be mined for minor royalties and ignored in his private ledger. His book signings are sparsely attended, reflecting a stagnating brand value that only attracts the most fringe consumers, further reinforcing his status as a man operating on the absolute margins of literary relevance. The inciting incident of the narrative arrives not through a dramatic supernatural manifestation, but through the analog, low-tech delivery system of the United States Postal Service, an anonymous postcard depicting the Dolphin Hotel. This postcard, featuring a simple, terrifying directive against entering room 1408, functions as a highly aggressive, unsolicited market disruption, challenging Enslin's established monopoly on cynical debunking. The ambiguity of the sender forces Enslin into a phase of rapid data acquisition. He retreats to his research space, treating the postcard as a potential lead for a new flagship product in his struggling book franchise. His initial investigation reveals a staggering statistical anomaly, a continuous, unbroken chain of fatalities associated with a single room in a prominent New York hotel, a data set that defies standard actuarial logic. To Enslin, these deaths are not human tragedies. They are a highly lucrative raw material, an untapped vein of intellectual property that could revitalize his entire publishing portfolio. He approaches the Dolphin Hotel as a hostile acquirer, utilizing the threat of the Federal Civil Rights Act as legal leverage to force a transaction that the institution is desperately trying to avoid. The Dolphin Hotel itself is introduced as a monolithic corporate entity, a bastion of old-world New York luxury that meticulously manages its public-facing brand while hiding a catastrophic liability on its upper floors. When Enslin arrives in the lobby, the film emphasizes the stark contrast between the regulated, highly polished hospitality environment and the chaotic, unregulated market of the supernatural that he is demanding to access. His confrontation with the hotel manager, Gerald Olin, is a masterclass in risk management and corporate negotiation, representing the ultimate clash between absolute skepticism and verifiable, historical trauma. Olin does not rely on folklore to deter Enslin. He relies on hard, indisputable analytics, opening a physical ledger that documents 56 confirmed deaths, treating them as catastrophic quarterly losses that the hotel has sustained over decades. This meeting in the manager's office is not a traditional horror movie warning. It is a high-stakes executive briefing where Olin attempts to aggressively mitigate the hotel's legal, moral, and public relations exposure. Olin attempts a corporate buyout of Enslin's curiosity, offering him an expensive bottle of vintage cognac and a free upgrade to a penthouse suite, a desperate, high-cost investment designed to preserve the author's life and the hotel's remaining integrity. However, Enslin's cognitive bias is so entrenched that he views Olin's genuine terror merely as a brilliant marketing strategy, assuming the manager is artificially inflating the value of the room through forced scarcity and staged intimidation. Enslin believes he is the smartest man in the boardroom, failing to realize that Olin is not trying to sell him a myth. Olin is trying to prevent a fatal bankruptcy of the author's soul. The script meticulously details the exact parameters of the room's lethality. Olin explicitly states that no one has lasted more than an hour, establishing a terrifying, inflexible timeline that functions as the narrative's central ticking clock. By refusing Olin's buyout, Enslin essentially signs a completely unregulated, high-risk contract, prioritizing his immediate intellectual arrogance over the overwhelming historical data presented to him. Olin's final resignation is a chilling display of executive defeat. He hands over the physical key with the grim finality of a banker authorizing a loan he knows will result in the immediate ruin of the borrower. As Enslin begins his physical ascension to the room, the environmental variables begin to shift. The elevator ride functions as a transition from the bustling, safe economy of the lobby to a completely isolated, hostile operational zone. The elevator operator's refusal to step onto the 14th floor, which is mathematically the 13th, highlighting the foundational superstitions the architecture is built upon, acts as the final external barrier to market entry. The hallway itself is devoid of the standard hospitality metrics. There are no maids, no ice machines, just an oppressive, silent vacuum leading to the heavy wooden door of the asset in question. Enslin approaches the door with his microcassette recorder engaged, narrating his actions with a clinical, detached vocabulary, attempting to maintain his analytical framework even as the psychological pressure begins to mount. His refusal to use the modern magnetic keycard, insisting on the heavy brass key, is a subtle physical interaction with the hotel's deep, analog history, a mechanical unlocking of a system that cannot be contained by modern firewalls. When he finally crosses the threshold into 1408, the initial visual data is deliberately underwhelming. The room is perfectly mundane, lacking any overt Gothic architecture or obvious supernatural markers. This mundane aesthetic is a brilliant exercise in deceptive packaging, lulling Enslin into a false sense of security and reinforcing his belief that the entire legend is merely a localized consumer fraud. He begins his standard operational procedure, testing the plumbing, analyzing the artwork, and speaking into his recorder, completely unaware that he has just stepped into an environment that perfectly mirrors his own psychological emptiness. The room is not a passive location, it is an active, predatory intelligence that immediately begins assessing Enslin's emotional vulnerabilities, preparing to launch a hostile takeover of his sanity. The script has spent this entire first act meticulously constructing Enslin's rigid, cynical worldview, ensuring that the audience understands the exact height from which this man is about to fall. We have witnessed the complete setup of a man who demands empirical evidence in all things, positioning him perfectly for a catastrophic market correction where the laws of physics, time, and biology will be entirely suspended. As the door clicks shut behind him, the transaction is finalized. Enslin is now entirely cut off from the rational economy of the outside world, locked in a zero-sum game with an entity that trades exclusively in despair. This concludes the foundational setup, establishing the exact psychological and economic parameters of the protagonist before the true volatility of the room is unleashed upon him. Upon crossing the threshold into the designated asset, Mike Enslin immediately initiates his standard operational protocol, treating the supposedly lethal environment with the casual disdain of a seasoned auditor walking into a low-level corporate compliance review. He deploys his physical R&D equipment, the microcassette recorder, the EMF meter, and the ultraviolet light, establishing a perimeter of empirical data collection designed to quickly debunk any localized myths and secure a rapid return on his time investment. The initial visual processing of the space yields a deliberate lack of actionable intelligence. The room presents itself as aggressively mundane, a perfectly sanitized hospitality unit that operates as a psychological smokescreen for the hostility lurking beneath its surface. This profound mediocrity is the room's opening gambit, a sophisticated form of deceptive market packaging intended to lull the consumer into a state of deep complacency, disarming his cognitive firewalls before initiating the true assault. Enslin's systematic dismantling of the room's atmosphere begins with the blacklight inspection, an attempt to uncover the hidden biological ledger of past occupants, yet even this forensic deep dive fails to trigger any immediate structural anomalies. The first true disruption to his operational baseline is almost microscopic in its subtlety, the spontaneous reconfiguration of the toilet paper and the inexplicable appearance of mints on his pillow, a silent breach of his physical security that immediately destabilizes his situational awareness. He attempts to rationalize these events as a highly coordinated, practical joke engineered by the hotel's executive management, refusing to accept that the local environment has already compromised his isolated workspace. This stubborn adherence to a rational economic model forces Enslin into a state of profound cognitive dissonance. His brain frantically attempts to balance a ledger where the input data is beginning to aggressively defy the established laws of physics and baseline logic. The room then escalates its hostile takeover by targeting the environmental controls, inducing a sudden, catastrophic failure of the thermostat that forces the ambient temperature to plunge, functioning as a physical stress test of his biological assets and endurance limits. Enslin contacts the front desk, attempting to utilize standard customer service channels to rectify the systemic failure, only to find the communication line artificially degraded, highlighting his complete detachment from any external support infrastructure or emergency rescue protocols. The true initiation of the room service level agreement occurs with the sudden, unauthorized activation of the clock radio, a blaring auditory assault featuring the Carpenter's track, "We've Only Just Begun," acting as a sinister corporate anthem for the psychological bankruptcy about to commence. The digital interface of the clock suddenly reconfigures its entire operational matrix, shifting from a standard timekeeping device into a relentless, 60-minute countdown mechanism, explicitly defining the terrifying temporal parameters of his impending physical liquidation. This digital countdown introduces a massive injection of market volatility into the narrative, establishing a rigid, unforgiving timeline that forces Enslin to completely abandon his leisurely data collection and pivot instantly into high-stakes crisis management. The psychological warfare abruptly shifts to immediate physical trauma. As Enslin attempts to manipulate the window to escape the oppressive auditory environment, the heavy wooden sash violently slams down, crushing his hand in a sudden, brutal exertion of kinetic force. This severe physical injury is a critical milestone in the room's aggressive strategy. It is a localized, biological market correction that completely obliterates Enslin's detached, analytical superiority, grounding him forcefully in the agonizing, visceral reality of flesh and blood. The sheer pain acts as a massive disruption to his cognitive bandwidth, forcing his internal processing power to divert entirely from skeptical observation to immediate biological preservation, marking a significant downgrade in his operational capacity and strategic foresight. In a desperate bid for exit liquidity, Enslin attempts to terminate the transaction entirely and leave the room, only to discover that the heavy brass key has been swallowed by the locking mechanism, and the physical door handle completely detaches in his frantic grasp. The removal of the door handle signifies the absolute sealing of the market. There is no longer a viable exit strategy, and Enslin is officially locked into a zero-sum engagement where the room controls all available assets, variables, and structural boundaries. His subsequent attempt to utilize the telephone system to call for an emergency extraction is met with a chilling display of the room's complete monopoly over local communications. He is connected to a synthetic, heavily modulated operator who refuses to acknowledge his distress. This operator functions as a terrifying automated customer service firewall, casually ignoring his demands for physical intervention and instead offering him unsolicited, grim room service options, further reinforcing his absolute isolation from humanity and external aid. The room begins to deploy its historical data as a weaponized psychological asset, projecting the visages of past victims, the previous stakeholders who failed this exact endurance test, forcing Enslin to witness their fatal leaps from the very window he just tried to open. These apparitions are not mere ghost stories, they are aggressive, high-definition projections of past market failures, designed specifically to erode his confidence and present suicide as the only logically sound exit strategy remaining in his rapidly depleting portfolio. Enslin's attempts to flag down external assistance by waving at the building across the street reveal a horrifying mirror reflection. The figure in the opposite window is an exact replica of himself, a doppelganger perfectly mimicking his desperation and panic. This optical illusion is a profound attack on his core identity, a sophisticated disruption of his visual processing center that forces him to realize the room is not just manipulating the physical environment, but actively hacking his psychological self-perception. The doppelganger suddenly falls to its death, serving as a gruesome, predictive model of his own impending demise, a targeted advertisement for total despair that the room broadcasts directly into his heavily compromised cognitive framework. As the 60-minute countdown steadily erodes his remaining temporal capital, the architectural geometry of the room itself begins to destabilize, transitioning from a static, Euclidean space into a fluid, predatory organism that actively shifts its physical boundaries. The paintings on the wall transition from benign, mass-produced hotel art into dynamic, threatening visual data streams, depicting nautical disasters that foreshadow the catastrophic environmental flooding that will soon breach his immediate perimeter. Enslin's primary tool for reality verification, his microcassette recorder, is weaponized against him. When he attempts to review his own audio logs, the playback is corrupted, forcing him to listen to his own voice engaging in an impossible, unrecorded dialogue. This malicious manipulation of his proprietary data proves that the room has completely infiltrated his internal R&D systems, ensuring that he can no longer trust his own hardware, his own auditory senses, or the very timeline of events he has personally experienced. The room utilizes targeted sensory deprivation to further isolate him, briefly rendering him completely deaf, a terrifying subtraction of his auditory processing power that leaves him highly vulnerable to sudden, unseen physical shifts in the hostile environment. When his hearing violently returns, it is accompanied by the deafening roar of a phantom television, blasting static and fractured imagery that aggressively overloads his sensory bandwidth and prevents any logical, strategic formulation of a viable escape plan. He attempts to utilize the analog infrastructure of the hotel to bypass the digital anomalies, crawling onto the external ledge of the building, executing a high-risk, low-probability physical maneuver to access the safety of the adjacent, unoccupied room. The exterior environment, however, proves to be completely controlled by the exact same hostile architecture. The windows of the other rooms have been structurally deleted, leaving him clinging to a sheer, endless brick facade suspended over a terrifying urban abyss. This sequence demonstrates that the room's operational jurisdiction extends far beyond its interior walls, encompassing the entire structural perimeter and ensuring that absolutely no physical loophole exists within its heavily fortified, monopolistic market structure. Enslin is forced to retreat back into the designated asset, his physical energy reserves severely depleted by the massive kinetic exertion of the ledge walk, his psychological defenses crumbling rapidly under the crushing weight of the impossible spatial geometry. The room begins to deploy highly personalized, targeted psychological attacks, tapping directly into the suppressed, traumatic data stored deep within Enslin's subconscious, pivoting gracefully from generic horror to hyperspecific, individualized emotional warfare. He is suddenly confronted with the agonizing auditory hallucination of his deceased father, a brutal, unprovoked extraction of his family history that the room utilizes to completely bypass his remaining cynical armor and strike directly at his unresolved grief. We must view this initial phase of the assault not merely as a supernatural haunting, but as a meticulously executed corporate liquidation strategy, where the room algorithmically identifies and exploits every single structural weakness in Enslin's operational architecture. His initial arrogance, the steadfast belief that he could easily commodify the trauma of Room 1408, is severely punished as the room flips the power dynamic, transforming the consumer of tragedy into the primary raw material for its next production cycle. The complete degradation of his technological safety net, from the uselessness of his portable laptop computer to the aggressive weaponization of his tape recorder, highlights the obsolescence of modern empirical tools when confronted with an ancient, highly adaptive intelligence. The first hour in Room 1408 is thus defined by a relentless, escalating series of hostile takeovers. It systematically dismantles his physical security, his environmental control, his communication channels, and his very perception of spatial and temporal reality. Enslin transitions rapidly from a confident, detached auditor of the supernatural into a desperate, heavily leveraged day trader of his own sanity, frantically attempting to balance a biological and psychological ledger that is hemorrhaging capital by the second. As the digital clock continues its merciless descent toward zero, the narrative solidifies its core thesis: the ultimate horror is not the mere presence of ghosts, but the complete, systematic removal of logic, control, and human connection from a man who built his entire life around those exact pillars. As the first act concludes and the true, devastating depth of the room's inventory is revealed, Enslin is forced to accept that his previous life of skeptical detachment was the true illusion, and he is now permanently trapped within the ultimate, inescapable reality. As the initial 60-minute countdown continues to liquidate Mike Enslin's physical endurance, the architectural intelligence of Room 1408 executes a profound strategic pivot, shifting its resources from environmental disruption to a highly targeted, hostile acquisition of his deepest psychological trauma. The room recognizes that blunt force kinetic attacks have failed to entirely bankrupt his skeptical framework, necessitating a more sophisticated algorithm of emotional warfare designed to exploit his most heavily guarded, depreciating internal assets. It begins by weaponizing his communication infrastructure, transforming his laptop, a tool previously used for external data transmission and brand building, into a compromised terminal that broadcasts his vulnerability directly to his estranged wife, Lily. This unauthorized access to his personal network is a severe breach of his emotional firewall, forcefully reintroducing the primary stakeholder of his past failures into the immediate volatility of the current market simulation. When Enslin attempts to utilize the video chat application to negotiate an extraction, the room intercepts the digital signal, executing a horrific deepfake manipulation where his own digital avatar mimics the suicide of past tenants. This visual data corruption proves that the room has achieved total administrative control over his digital and optical inputs, turning his own technological safety net into an aggressive liability that actively accelerates his psychological insolvency. The environment then aggressively escalates its atmospheric pressure, triggering the overhead sprinkler system not as a safety mechanism, but as a weaponized plumbing failure intended to simulate a catastrophic flood of his operational space. Simultaneously, the maritime disaster depicted in the room's mass-produced artwork breaches its two-dimensional containment, projecting a violent, aquatic storm directly into the physical geometry of the hotel suite, completely obliterating the boundary between static art and dynamic threat. Enslin is subjected to a terrifying sensory overload, forced to physically navigate a localized hurricane that represents the chaotic, uncontrollable surge of his own repressed grief and historical guilt regarding his family's dissolution. In a desperate bid for temperature regulation and environmental control, he attempts to access the HVAC system, crawling into the ventilation shafts, a classic cinematic maneuver of physical extraction that the room immediately neutralizes. The ductwork operates not as an escape vector, but as a claustrophobic, dead-end labyrinth, a physical manifestation of his own cyclical, trapped cognitive processes, populated by the mummified remains of previous stakeholders who attempted the exact same operational pivot. Forced to retreat back into the primary asset, Enslin's cognitive framework is further degraded when the room violently shifts its environmental parameters from aquatic flooding to an extreme, sub-zero deep freeze, inducing rapid biological depreciation. This sudden market shock of extreme cold mirrors the emotional numbness and isolation he has actively cultivated for years, weaponizing his own defensive coping mechanisms against his failing cardiovascular system. It is within this frozen, isolated ledger that the room deploys its most devastating psychological asset, the auditory and visual manifestation of his deceased daughter, Katie, the foundational trauma that initially drove his spiritual bankruptcy. The projection of Katie is not a mere phantom, it is a hyper-realistic, emotional deepfake, an interactive simulation perfectly engineered to bypass all of his remaining intellectual armor and strike directly at his core liability. The room forces Enslin to re-experience the agonizing emotional expenditure of losing his child, demanding that he pay the psychological toll that he has spent years avoiding through his cynical, transactional ghost-hunting career. When the apparition of his daughter physically crumbles in his arms, turning to ash, it represents the absolute liquidation of his emotional reserves. The room has successfully extracted his deepest sorrow, repackaged it, and sold it back to him at a lethal markup. Having completely decimated his psychological infrastructure, the room then executes its most brilliant and cruel maneuver, the deployment of a highly sophisticated, multi-tiered false reality, a simulation within the simulation. Enslin seemingly wakes up on a California beach, physically removed from the oppressive architecture of the Dolphin Hotel, treated by medical professionals, and slowly reintegrated into a stable, functional reality alongside Lily. This sequence functions as a massive, deceptive injection of false hope, an artificial market recovery designed to make him believe that the catastrophic losses of Room 1408 were merely the result of a temporary neurological glitch or a surfing accident. He spends weeks, possibly months within this simulated recovery, successfully rebuilding his emotional portfolio, repairing his marriage, and even drafting a new manuscript that completely dismisses the events of the hotel as a psychological breakdown. The room allows him to invest heavily in this restored reality, waiting for his emotional bandwidth to fully commit to the illusion of safety, ensuring that the impending crash will be mathematically devastating. The revelation of the simulation's falsehood occurs with brutal efficiency within a post office, a mundane setting of logistical order that suddenly violently deconstructs, its walls tearing away to reveal the charred, frozen remnants of the hotel suite. This architectural bait-and-switch is the ultimate demonstration of the room's monopoly over his perception. It proves that escape is not a physical metric, but a psychological impossibility within its heavily fortified jurisdiction. Enslin's entire restored life is liquidated in an instant, a catastrophic market correction that plunges him back into the freezing, isolated reality of 1408, compounding his initial trauma with the fresh devastation of a stolen future. The false escape is a masterclass in behavioral economics. The room understands that suffering is exponentially increased when contrasted with the sudden, violent revocation of profound relief and established security. Stripped of his false reality, Enslin is forced to confront the absolute permanence of his confinement, realizing that the room does not merely kill its occupants, it actively manages their descent into madness, maximizing the yield of their despair. The physical space of the room is now completely destroyed, a burnt, frozen wasteland that mirrors the absolute desolation of his internal landscape, devoid of any structural integrity or operational utility. As the digital clock resets, a terrifying indication that his temporal capital is infinite and his suffering operates on a recurring, inescapable subscription model, the room makes its final corporate offer. The automated phone system provides him with the option of an express checkout, a thinly veiled demand for his suicide, presenting self-termination as the only remaining, viable transaction in this entirely bankrupted economy. A localized, physical noose is provided by the room, hung efficiently from the ceiling, acting as the ultimate financial instrument for his immediate, permanent liquidation from the market. The psychological escalation of this second act successfully transitions Enslin from a state of arrogant, analytical resistance to a state of profound, existential submission, systematically stripping him of his technology, his memories, and his hope. We are forced to observe the complete dismantling of a human being's operational framework, a brutal corporate restructuring of his soul, orchestrated by an entity that views human tragedy purely as a recurring revenue stream. The Room has successfully proven that empirical data and cynical detachment are useless currencies when trapped within a monopoly that controls the very fabric of memory, time, and emotional reality. The relentless manipulation of his past proves that the true haunting does not stem from external specters, but from the weaponization of the protagonist's own unresolved liabilities. As Enslin stares at the reset clock and the waiting noose, the narrative positions him at the absolute bottom of a volatile psychological market, seemingly devoid of any remaining leverage. This concludes our examination of the psychological escalation, mapping the precise methodology the Room utilized to completely crash Enslin's emotional and cognitive systems. To fully deconstruct the psychological architecture of Mike Enslin within the localized monopoly of Room 1408, we must analyze his cognitive framework through the rigorous, unforgiving lens of behavioral economics. Enslin does not operate as a traditional protagonist seeking truth, rather, he functions as an emotional short seller, an individual who has built a lucrative, defensive portfolio by aggressively betting against the existence of hope, spirituality, and the afterlife. His entire career as a cynical debunker of the paranormal is fundamentally a massive risk mitigation strategy, a deliberate cognitive architecture designed to completely insulate him from the catastrophic volatility of his own unresolved grief. Following the tragic, protracted death of his daughter, Katie, Enslin experienced a total systemic collapse of his personal belief system, an emotional bankruptcy so absolute that he was forced to liquidate all remaining spiritual assets. In behavioral economics, the principle of loss aversion dictates that the psychological pain of losing is mathematically twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining. Enslin internalizes this by refusing to ever invest in hope again. By actively seeking out haunted locations and proving them to be fraudulent, he engages in a form of psychological arbitrage, extracting minor, temporary dividends of superiority to offset the massive, toxic debt of his daughter's demise. He treats the historical tragedies of the hotels he visits as easily commodified raw materials, entirely detached from the human cost, processing localized trauma with the cold, sociopathic efficiency of a corporate liquidator. When he crosses the threshold into the designated asset of 1408, he encounters an intelligence that operates not as a traditional spectral entity, but as a highly aggressive, apex predator in the market of behavioral manipulation. The Room instantly identifies Enslin's cynical detachment not as a strength, but as a massive, over-leveraged liability, a rigid cognitive firewall that is highly susceptible to hyper-targeted, emotional cyberattacks. Initially, the Room tests his defenses with minor environmental anomalies, effectively probing his psychological perimeter to calculate the exact threshold at which his empirical, rational ledger begins to show critical discrepancies. As the physical environment violently destabilizes, Enslin falls victim to the illusion of control, a cognitive bias where he frantically attempts to apply standard operational procedures, calling the front desk, mapping the architecture, to a market that has completely abandoned all regulatory frameworks. The entity within the walls recognizes that Enslin's primary currency is his perceived intellectual superiority. Therefore, the Room's initial phase of assault is explicitly designed to bankrupt his trust in his own sensory data and analytical hardware. By corrupting his microcassette recorder and projecting his exact doppelganger into the adjacent window, the Room initiates a hostile takeover of his core identity, forcing a sudden, terrifying devaluation of his own self-perception. We must examine the Room's strategic deployment of the 60-minute digital countdown mechanism. This is not merely a ticking clock, but a brilliant implementation of artificial scarcity designed to induce sheer, unadulterated market panic. The introduction of a rigid temporal boundary forces Enslin's prefrontal cortex to completely shut down its higher-order, strategic processing, pivoting his biological resources entirely into short-term, high-risk, reptilian survival transactions. As his cognitive bandwidth narrows under the crushing weight of the countdown, the Room pivots to its most devastating economic strategy, the weaponization of his profound, unresolved sunk cost fallacy. Enslin has spent years, and the entirety of his professional reputation, building a brand on the absolute certainty that life after death does not exist. To admit that Room 1408 is real is to accept the total, instantaneous devaluation of his entire life's work. However, the Room violently forces this market correction upon him, presenting him with the agonizing reality that if the supernatural is real, then his daughter's suffering and his subsequent abandonment of his wife were not just tragic, but profoundly, cosmically catastrophic. The simulation of his daughter, Katie, dying in his arms within the sub-zero environment of the frozen suite represents the ultimate extraction of his emotional capital, a targeted audit of his deepest guilt that leaves him entirely devoid of psychological equity. It is crucial to analyze the room's utilization of the false escape sequence, the simulated return to a stabilized California reality, as a masterstroke of predatory behavioral engineering and market manipulation. The room artificially inflates a massive bubble of hope and recovery, allowing Enslin to reinvest his heavily depleted emotional resources into repairing his marriage and his psyche, maximizing his exposure to the eventual, inevitable crash. When the post office walls tear away to reveal the charred remains of the hotel room, the resulting market shock is mathematically devastating. The room has stolen not only his past and his present, but has violently liquidated his perceived future. This rapid boom-and-bust cycle of hope and despair is explicitly designed to break his psychological resistance permanently, proving that the entity does not merely want to kill him, but wishes to maximize the yield of his suffering before termination. The express checkout, offered by the automated phone system, the literal presentation of a hangman's noose, is the logical conclusion of this predatory business model, presenting self-termination as the most economically viable exit strategy for a completely bankrupted asset. The room acts as a predatory lender, having systematically stripped him of his technology, his mobility, his reality, and his family, leaving him with an insurmountable debt of despair that can only be settled through immediate, biological liquidation. Enslin is forced to confront the terrifying reality that his cynical independence was always a localized illusion. He is, and always has been, entirely at the mercy of macroeconomic forces, both emotional and supernatural, that he cannot predict, control, or outsmart. His transition from an arrogant auditor to a desperate, broken stakeholder is complete. His cognitive biases have been weaponized against him, his defensive mechanisms dismantled, and his core identity subjected to a total, hostile restructuring. The room demonstrates a terrifying proficiency in emotional data mining, utilizing Enslin's own memories as the primary algorithmic inputs to generate a perfectly customized, inescapable hell that operates with sociopathic corporate efficiency. By viewing the supernatural entity not as a ghost, but as a relentless, flawless market mechanism designed to extract the maximum possible despair from its human commodities, the true, agonizing horror of 1408 is fully realized. This psychological autopsy reveals that the most terrifying monsters are not those that lurk in the shadows, but those that understand our internal ledgers better than we do, and possess the power to aggressively short-sell our remaining sanity. As we close the ledger on the psychological framework of Mike Enslin, we understand that his ultimate battle is not against the room itself, but against the horrific, inescapable truth of his own profound vulnerabilities and historical failures. This deep integration of behavioral economics and trauma psychology concludes our analysis of the character's internal architecture, perfectly positioning us to examine how this localized psychological warfare transitions into the third act's explosive physical resolution. As we open the financial ledger to conduct a thorough autopsy of the production budget, marketing strategy, and ultimate return on investment for 1408, we must first analyze the macroeconomic climate of the 2007 theatrical marketplace. The project was greenlit by Dimension Films with an allocated production budget of approximately $25 million, a figure that positions it perfectly within the highly lucrative, mid-tier risk bracket for studio horror features. This specific capital deployment strategy is a masterclass in risk mitigation, carefully avoiding the bloated, nine-figure budgets of summer blockbusters while providing enough financial runway to secure premium intellectual property and A-list talent. The fundamental economic advantage of 1408 lies in its highly contained narrative architecture. By restricting the vast majority of the runtime to a single physical location, a meticulously constructed soundstage replica of a hotel suite, the production drastically minimized its logistical overhead. This localized manufacturing process effectively eliminated the unpredictable variable costs associated with extensive location shoots, complex weather delays, and multi-unit logistical footprint expansion, ensuring a highly controlled and predictable capital burn rate. However, to prevent this contained environment from feeling visually bankrupt or financially compromised, the producers smartly reallocated these savings directly into high-fidelity visual effects and sophisticated, practical environmental manipulation. The physical construction of the room had to function as a dynamic, shifting puzzle box, requiring advanced hydraulic rigs, complex plumbing systems for the flooding sequences, and breakaway architecture to simulate the room's violent, psychological deterioration. By investing heavily in the mechanical reality of the suite, the filmmakers ensured that the visual ROI remained exceptionally high, providing the audience with a tangible, kinetic spectacle that entirely masks the fundamental cost-saving nature of a single-room thriller. The acquisition of the underlying intellectual property was perhaps the most crucial financial transaction of the entire enterprise. Securing a narrative generated by Stephen King provides an immediate, massive multiplier to the film's inherent brand equity. Stephen King's name functions as a universally recognized, blue-chip commodity within the horror market, carrying decades of established consumer trust and guaranteeing a baseline demographic acquisition that original, untested properties simply cannot command. To execute this intellectual property, the studio engaged in a highly strategic labor acquisition, securing John Cusack to carry the overwhelming majority of the runtime, essentially acting as the sole physical asset on screen for over an hour. This places a massive operational burden on a single performer, requiring Cusack to deliver a hyper-intensive, psychologically exhausting performance that functions as the primary emotional engine and focal point for the audience's investment. To balance this localized risk and provide additional weight to the marketing campaign, the producers acquired Samuel L. Jackson for a highly concentrated, low-duration shooting schedule, maximizing his immense star power while minimizing his impact on the overall payroll. Jackson's presence in the critical early scenes acts as a heavy-duty, premium anchor for the narrative setup, providing immediate gravitas and allowing the marketing department to leverage two highly recognizable faces on the theatrical poster. When we analyze the marketing and distribution strategy deployed by Dimension Films, we see a brilliant exercise in demographic expansion and calculated counter-programming within the fiercely competitive summer blockbuster season. The film was strategically scheduled for a late June release in 2007, a period traditionally dominated by massive, expensive franchises such as Transformers, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Harry Potter, which monopolized the four-quadrant audience. Rather than attempting to compete directly with these financial behemoths in the realm of family-friendly spectacle, 1408 was positioned as the premium, sophisticated alternative, aggressively targeting adult audiences and older teenagers seeking psychological stimulation rather than pure CGI fatigue. Crucially, the studio navigated the regulatory framework of the Motion Picture Association of America to secure a PG-13 rating, a highly calculated corporate maneuver designed to drastically widen the total addressable market. By deliberately restricting the overt, R-rated gore in favor of intense, bloodless psychological terror, the distributors successfully bypassed the age gate restrictions that historically limit the financial ceilings of traditional horror films. This regulatory compliance allowed the marketing campaign to heavily target the lucrative teenage demographic, ensuring that multiplexes could sell tickets to high school audiences during the highly profitable summer evening windows. The promotional materials themselves were a masterclass in building artificial scarcity and leveraging the fear of the unknown. The trailers heavily utilized the visual of the room's brass key and the chilling auditory warning that no one lasts more than an hour. This marketing algorithm bypassed complex narrative exposition, instead selling the consumer a high-stakes, 60-minute endurance test, promising a localized, high-intensity thrill ride that completely aligned with the fast-paced consumption habits of the era. The financial results of this synchronized production and marketing strategy were nothing short of spectacular, resulting in a textbook execution of high-yield market penetration and global revenue generation. The film opened to over $20 million in its first domestic weekend, immediately proving the viability of its counter-programming strategy and effectively returning a massive portion of its production budget within the first 3 days of trading. Displaying remarkable resilience and low week-to-week depreciation, 1408 ultimately accumulated over $71 million in the domestic market, a testament to strong word-of-mouth and the enduring appeal of the Stephen King brand. The international market provided an equally robust revenue stream, adding an additional $61 million to the ledger, completely validating the global, language-agnostic appeal of universal psychological fears such as isolation and grief. When the final theatrical audits were concluded, the film had generated a staggering $132 million in global gross, a massive multiplier that represented a return of more than 5 times its initial production expenditure. This phenomenal EBITDA-style margin solidified 1408 as a major financial victory for the Weinstein Company and Dimension Films, proving that highly contained, character-driven psychological horror could achieve blockbuster-level profitability if engineered correctly. However, the monetization of this cinematic asset did not cease with the conclusion of its theatrical window. The transition to the home video market in the fourth quarter of 2007 introduced a brilliant, secondary revenue strategy. The DVD release was heavily marketed around the inclusion of a director's cut, featuring an entirely different, substantially darker ending that was famously altered after initial test audiences rejected its bleak, uncompromising finality. By leveraging this alternate ending, the studio created artificial narrative scarcity, heavily incentivizing consumers who had already paid for a theatrical ticket to execute a secondary transaction just to acquire the complete, uncompromised artistic vision. This strategy of selling multiple timelines of the same product is a highly sophisticated form of physical media capitalization, maximizing the lifetime value of the consumer and ensuring the film dominated the high-margin DVD sales charts during the holiday season. Furthermore, the film's contained nature and reliance on psychological tension over dated digital effects have allowed it to maintain immense syndication value in the modern streaming and cable television ecosystems. It continues to generate fractional digital dividends and licensing fees a decade and a half after its creation, proving that a well-crafted exploration of human grief and isolation is an entirely depreciation-proof commodity. The financial autopsy of 1408 reveals a project that operated with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate hedge fund, minimizing physical exposure, leveraging high-value intellectual property, and utilizing regulatory ratings to maximize audience acquisition. It stands as a definitive case study in how to successfully engineer a mid-budget thriller, proving that the most profitable special effect in the cinematic marketplace is a brilliant actor slowly losing his mind inside a highly controlled, inexpensive box. As we close the ledger on the production economics and box office analytics, we are perfectly positioned to transition into the mechanical realities of the set, exploring the specific filmmaking technology and practical innovations required to bring this profitable nightmare to life. As we transition into the production management and studio economics of 1408, we must first analyze the unique, highly concentrated logistical challenges of manufacturing a feature-length cinematic narrative almost entirely within the rigidly restricted architectural geometry of a single physical asset. The executive leadership team, spearheaded by director Michael Hafstrom and seasoned producer Lorenzo di Bonaventura, faced a complex, multi-tiered operational paradox: how to continuously maintain visual volatility, escalating tension, and high consumer engagement while aggressively suppressing the geographical footprint of the primary production schedule. Unlike sprawling, multi-location action blockbusters that require massive, decentralized logistical deployments and astronomical transportation budgets, this production functioned more like an intensive, localized laboratory experiment, where the entire capital focus was directed inward. The primary resources were concentrated onto a few meticulously engineered, highly controlled soundstages at Pinewood Studios in the United Kingdom, allowing the studio's accounting department to completely eliminate the unpredictable, high-risk variables of exterior weather patterns and complex urban permit negotiations. By anchoring the production in an indoor facility, the management team avoided the costly, time-consuming transportation of heavy grip and lighting equipment between shooting locations, ensuring a highly predictable, linear capital burn rate and turning the volatility of the horror genre into a mathematically sound manufacturing pipeline. However, this extreme geographical containment placed an unprecedented, highly concentrated burden on the primary human capital of the project, specifically John Cusack, who functioned as the sole operational asset for the vast majority of the intense shooting schedule. Managing this specific labor dynamic required a highly specialized psychological and logistical approach from the director, as Cusack was effectively subjected to weeks of intense, simulated isolation, carrying the entire narrative and emotional weight of the enterprise completely on his own shoulders. The production schedule could not rely on the standard industry practice of rotating cast members or deploying massive secondary units to offset physical fatigue. The daily call sheets essentially demanded maximum, unyielding output from a single, heavily leveraged stakeholder. To mitigate the severe risk of creative bankruptcy or physical exhaustion, the management team had to meticulously calibrate the shooting rhythm, ensuring that the relentless, high-anxiety physical sequences were perfectly balanced with necessary logistical downtime to preserve the long-term integrity of their core investment. The integration of Samuel L. Jackson in the preliminary stages of production operated as a highly efficient, high-impact injection of secondary star power, requiring minimal scheduling overhead and capital expenditure while delivering a massive, immediate boost to the project's overall brand valuation. The true operational genius of 1408 lies in the management of its physical sets, which were not static environments, but highly dynamic, heavily engineered mechanisms designed to systematically degrade and destruct according to a rigid, unforgiving production timeline. The physical construction of the room had to function as a shifting puzzle box, requiring a deep integration of mechanical engineering principles, specifically the deployment of advanced hydraulic rigs and breakaway architecture, to simulate the room's violent, rapid psychological deterioration. The art department was forced to construct multiple, highly detailed iterations of the hotel suite, each representing a different phase of the room's degradation, requiring a massive, upfront investment of capital into raw materials and rapid, localized set construction logistics. This meant that the production schedule had to be meticulously organized around the physical liquidation of the primary asset. Once a specific iteration of the room was burned, frozen, or destroyed, there was absolutely no cost-effective way to reverse the timeline and capture missed data. Therefore, the margin for operational error was mathematically zero. The director and the special effects supervisors had to execute their vision flawlessly on the very first attempt, as the severe financial penalty for resetting a demolished set would have completely compromised the film's budgetary framework. The management of the aquatic sequences required a sophisticated pivot in operational methodology, essentially becoming a localized exercise in stream mechanics and fluid dynamics, as thousands of gallons of water had to be perfectly calibrated to destroy the set without causing catastrophic liability. This highly dangerous protocol necessitated the utilization of massive, specialized water tanks and highly rigorous, risk-intensive underwater filming procedures to ensure the biological safety of the primary stakeholder while capturing the necessary high-yield visual data. While the interior destruction was successfully manufactured in the highly controlled environment of Pinewood Studios, the production management still had to carefully negotiate the complex, international logistics of establishing the exterior reality of the Dolphin Hotel in New York City. This required a precise, transatlantic operational pipeline, dispatching a specialized secondary unit directly to Manhattan to capture the essential establishing shots and exterior architectural data needed to ground the supernatural narrative in a tangible, recognizable consumer reality. The historic Roosevelt Hotel in New York provided the necessary grand, old-world aesthetic for the exterior and lobby sequences, requiring the production to briefly but intensely interface with the massive, unpredictable infrastructure of a functioning, real-world hospitality asset. Managing this split-location strategy, seamlessly blending the authentic, uncontrollable reality of Manhattan with the highly synthetic, hyper-controlled reality of a British soundstage, demanded a rigorous continuity protocol, ensuring that the consumer never detected the physical seams of the production's geographical arbitrage. The studio economics dictating these specific geographical decisions were transparently clear. It was mathematically more viable and significantly less legally complex to manufacture a replica of a New York hotel room in a subsidized British facility than it was to attempt practical destruction in Manhattan. As principal photography finally concluded and the raw physical data was transferred into the post-production pipeline, the studio executives at Dimension Films assumed a much more aggressive, hands-on role in shaping and refining the final consumer product. The editing process for 1408 was not merely an assembly of captured footage, it was a highly contested, strategic corporate negotiation regarding the precise level of psychological trauma that the primary target demographic could realistically sustain without rejecting the product entirely. This intense corporate oversight culminated in a massive, 11th-hour operational pivot regarding the film's conclusion, a decision driven entirely by the ruthless, analytical feedback generated during the studio's early test screening protocols and audience data acquisition. The original, director-approved cut featured a bleak, uncompromising finale that physically liquidated the protagonist entirely. However, the studio's rigorous consumer analytics revealed that this level of absolute, unredeemed despair generated a severely negative market response. This negative audience data was perceived as a massive liability, directly threatening the film's crucial opening weekend word-of-mouth momentum and severely limiting its overall, long-term theatrical profitability across domestic and international markets. Consequently, the executive board mandated the costly execution of localized reshoots to manufacture a slightly more ambiguous, slightly less devastating theatrical ending, proving that in the ecosystem of studio economics, artistic vision must frequently yield to the empirical data of audience satisfaction. This strategic alteration highlights the fundamental tension between the creative labor force and the corporate management structure, where the ultimate fiduciary responsibility is not to deliver a flawless artistic statement, but to successfully launch a highly profitable, widely accepted consumer good. The existence of these multiple, conflicting endings later became a highly lucrative asset in the home video market, allowing the studio to cleverly monetize the very conflict that occurred in the boardroom, selling the consumer both the focus-grouped compromise and the original artistic intent. When we formally audit the complete lifecycle of 1408's production management, we observe an enterprise that operated with the clinical, risk-averse precision of a hedge fund carefully navigating a highly volatile, completely unpredictable entertainment market. The leadership team successfully managed an intense, high-pressure labor environment, executed complex, destructive physical engineering on a tight schedule, and displayed the ruthless corporate agility necessary to immediately alter the core product based on real-time consumer feedback. When we subject the narrative architecture of 1408 to the rigorous, empirical scrutiny of historical and scientific accuracy, we must immediately acknowledge that the film operates as a deliberate, calculated subversion of physical laws, utilizing biological and thermodynamic impossibilities to engineer psychological trauma. Historically, the concept of the haunted hotel room is a highly documented, real-world liability within the hospitality economy, with institutions like the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles or the Chelsea Hotel in New York possessing deep, morbid ledgers of localized tragedy and actual human capitalization. However, the film's foundational premise, a single room responsible for exactly 56 verifiable, consecutive fatalities spanning nearly a century, represents a statistical and actuarial impossibility that would fundamentally bankrupt the risk management protocols of any functional, real-world corporate hospitality enterprise. In a realistic legal and economic framework, an asset with such a catastrophic mortality rate would not be maintained as a viable, occupiable unit. It would be permanently decommissioned, gutted, or repurposed by the hotel's legal department to aggressively mitigate the massive, recurring exposure to wrongful death litigation. The character of Gerald Olin accurately portrays the historical reality of corporate obfuscation, demonstrating how luxury hospitality brands meticulously sanitize their public-facing ledgers to protect their brand equity from the depreciating stain of localized, high-profile fatalities. Transitioning from corporate history to the specific technological apparatus of the protagonist, we must audit Mike Enslin's deployment of standard ghost hunting R&D equipment, specifically the electromagnetic field (EMF) meter and the ultraviolet blacklight, tools that form the empirical baseline of his investigative methodology. Scientifically, EMF meters are highly sensitive industrial instruments originally engineered to detect anomalous radiation from municipal power lines or faulty electrical wiring, tracking the localized flux of electromagnetic capital within a heavily structured, man-made environment. Enslin's reliance on this hardware represents a fascinating historical pivot in the parapsychology market, where enthusiasts have systematically repurposed standard industrial diagnostic tools to artificially quantify the unquantifiable, effectively creating a pseudoscientific metric for spiritual volatility. In standard scientific reality, a spike on an EMF meter within a century-old New York hotel room is not an indicator of a hostile spectral takeover, but rather a verifiable symptom of outdated, unshielded copper wiring generating localized, high-yield electromagnetic interference. The ultraviolet blacklight sequence is grounded in accurate forensic biology. UV radiation reliably forces specific biological fluids and cleaning chemical residues to fluoresce, exposing the hidden, unsanitary historical ledger of previous occupants that standard hospitality cleaning protocols fail to completely liquidate. However, the film rapidly abandons this baseline of diagnostic realism, initiating a series of catastrophic environmental anomalies that violently violate the foundational laws of physics, specifically targeting the principles of thermodynamics and fluid mechanics to terrorize its primary stakeholder. The sequence wherein the room's HVAC system triggers a rapid, catastrophic plunge into sub-zero temperatures represents a staggering thermodynamic impossibility, a complete breakdown of the mathematical limits governing standard commercial climate control infrastructure. To execute a flash freeze of that volumetric magnitude within minutes, the room would require the sudden deployment of industrial-grade liquid nitrogen and a massive, localized expenditure of thermal energy that simply cannot be generated by a conventional, hotel-grade heating and cooling matrix. This thermal market shock is not a scientific phenomenon, but a psychological weapon. It perfectly simulates the physiological symptoms of extreme exposure and biological depreciation, forcing Enslin's cardiovascular system into a state of rapid, unavoidable insolvency. Similarly, the sudden, localized aquatic flooding of the room entirely defies the rigid, mathematical constraints of structural engineering and architectural load-bearing capacities standard to high-rise Manhattan construction. Water is an incredibly heavy, dense physical asset, and the sudden accumulation of thousands of gallons within a single, contained suite would exert catastrophic kinetic pressure on the structural joists, leading to an immediate, massive floor collapse rather than creating a contained, aquatic simulation. The sudden deafness inflicted upon Enslin represents a fascinating exploration of neurological market disruption, accurately reflecting how the human brain processes severe sensory deprivation and acute, localized physical trauma. In documented scientific isolation experiments, when the auditory cortex is aggressively starved of external acoustic data, the brain often attempts to aggressively balance its sensory ledger by spontaneously generating powerful, terrifying auditory hallucinations to fill the vacuum. The film weaponizes this neurological vulnerability, isolating Enslin's acoustic bandwidth to destabilize his spatial awareness, proving that the removal of data can be just as traumatizing as the aggressive injection of hostile stimuli. Furthermore, we must analyze the physics of the external ledge-walking sequence, where Enslin attempts a high-risk physical extraction, only to discover that the architectural geometry of the entire hotel exterior has been completely deleted by the room's intelligence. This visual manipulation demonstrates a complete suspension of Euclidean geometry. The room is presented not as a physical space operating within the gravitational and spatial constraints of New York City, but as a hyperdimensional tesseract that algorithms its boundaries based purely on the victim's psychological despair. From a psychological perspective, however, the film is devastatingly accurate in its clinical depiction of prolonged grief, the sunk cost fallacy, and the agonizing, non-linear trajectory of emotional trauma following the loss of a child. Enslin's profound emotional bankruptcy and his reliance on cynical detachment are highly documented, scientifically valid defense mechanisms utilized by individuals attempting to mitigate the crushing, daily liability of complex bereavement. The room acts as a metaphorical, highly accelerated exposure therapy, violently stripping away his carefully constructed cognitive firewalls and forcing him to directly process the raw, unfiltered data of his daughter's death. Therefore, while the film routinely bankrupts the laws of physics, thermodynamics, and structural engineering, its core narrative strength is derived entirely from its absolute, unyielding adherence to the clinical realities of human emotional suffering. The technology Enslin uses to record the event, the microcassette recorder, is historically accurate for the early 2000s era of the narrative, acting as a reliable, analog data capture device that operates free from the unpredictable volatility of modern digital cloud networks. Yet, the room's ability to retroactively manipulate the magnetic tape, forcing it to play back impossible conversations, violates the physical laws of magnetic data storage, proving that the entity possesses full administrative access over all localized technology, both digital and analog. The film also touches upon the historical reality of the doppelganger phenomenon, a deeply rooted psychological and historical concept where an individual perceives a perfect, external replica of their own biological form. Scientifically, otoscopic hallucinations, the neurological glitch of seeing one's own body from an external perspective, are highly documented symptoms of extreme stress, sleep deprivation, and severe neurological dysfunction, perfectly aligning with Enslin's compromised biological state. When we synthesize these disparate elements, we realize that the true genius of 1408 is its deliberate, surgical weaponization of scientific impossibilities to highlight deeply authentic, historical human truths about grief and isolation. The filmmakers utilized the audience's basic understanding of environmental stability as a foundational baseline, intentionally crashing that stability to generate maximum consumer anxiety and highly profitable theatrical tension. By the time the room begins actively melting and freezing, the viewer has already abandoned their demand for empirical accuracy, having fully bought into the emotional economy of the protagonist's localized nightmare. This autopsy of the film's historical and scientific framework reveals a production that knew exactly when to adhere to reality and when to completely liquidate the laws of physics to achieve its terrifying, highly lucrative narrative goals. The Room is not a scientific anomaly, it is a meticulously engineered corporate hellscape, designed to audit the soul of its occupant by systematically dismantling their entire understanding of the physical universe. Having completed this rigorous evaluation of the film's relationship with empirical reality and historical truth, we are now perfectly positioned to analyze the specific visual engineering and cinematography required to capture this descending, physics-defying madness. As we initiate our audit of the cinematography and visual engineering deployed in 1408, we must recognize that the camera is not merely a passive recording device, but an active, aggressive stakeholder in the psychological liquidation of Mike Enslin. The director of photography, Benoit Delhomme, engineered a visual language that operates on a principle of systematic destabilization, treating the cinematic frame as a rigidly controlled asset that slowly hemorrhages structural integrity. In the opening sequences, before Enslin enters the primary asset, the cinematography is characterized by objective, stable compositions, utilizing standard focal lengths and smooth camera support systems to reflect his complete, arrogant control over his intellectual portfolio. His book signing and subsequent surfing sequences are lit with natural, diffuse light, establishing a baseline of environmental safety and emotional detachment, a visual representation of a man whose market volatility is currently flatlining. The transition into the Dolphin Hotel lobby marks the first subtle shift in visual economics. The lighting becomes warmer, highly directional, and intensely manicured, highlighting the expensive, old-world corporate facade of the hospitality enterprise. The visual data here is rich with deep reds, polished brass, and dark woods, creating an atmosphere of institutional weight and historical permanence that visually contrasts with Enslin's transient, low-value consumer lifestyle. When Enslin crosses the threshold into room 1408, the initial visual strategy is a masterclass in deceptive packaging and aesthetic bankruptcy. The room is aggressively lit to appear completely mundane, devoid of any traditional Gothic shadows or high-contrast horror signifiers. Delham utilizes flat, even illumination, ensuring that every corner of the room is visible, a visual tactic that lulls the consumer into a false sense of security by mathematically eliminating the dark spaces where threats traditionally hide. This high-visibility environment perfectly aligns with Enslin's empirical, data-driven worldview. If he can see everything, he assumes he can audit everything, maintaining his illusion of absolute environmental control. However, as the room initiates its hostile takeover, the visual engineering undergoes a profound, localized paradigm shift, mirroring the rapid depreciation of Enslin's psychological assets. The camera begins to abandon its objective stability, increasingly relying on handheld mechanics and subtle, unsettling Dutch angles that slowly tilt the horizon line, physically representing the severe market correction occurring within Enslin's cognitive framework. This shift in framing geometry acts as a visual force multiplier, inducing a subliminal kinetic friction that prevents the audience from ever resting comfortably within the two-dimensional space of the screen. Delham's lighting design evolves from flat and mundane to highly directional and aggressive, utilizing harsh practical sources within the room, such as the bedside lamps and the bathroom fluorescents, to create deep, impenetrable shadows that rapidly consume the navigable floor space. The color grading timeline of the film is a meticulously calibrated descent into visual hell. The initial warm, neutral tones of the hotel are slowly drained, replaced by a sickly, jaundiced yellow and an oppressive, suffocating green that dominates the midtones. This specific color science is not arbitrary. It visually simulates the biological symptoms of nausea, decay, and physical sickness, directly linking the environmental aesthetic to Enslin's rapidly failing physiological state. During the sequence where the room's thermostat plummets to sub-zero temperatures, the visual engineering pivots entirely to a harsh, monochromatic blue and stark white palette, executing a massive thermal market shock on the visual spectrum. The implementation of practical frost, freezing breath, and the crushing, icy highlights completely liquidates the visual warmth of the frame, isolating Enslin within a frozen, unforgiving ledger of his own emotional numbness. To capture this thermal descent, the camera frequently employs tight, claustrophobic close-ups on Cusack's face, aggressively cropping out the surrounding environment to emphasize his absolute physical isolation and his shrinking sphere of influence. These extreme close-ups function as visual audits of his micro-expressions, forcing the consumer to intimately track every marginal percentage point of hope as it drains from his biological hardware. The deployment of shallow depth of field acts as a critical mechanism for visual isolation. By keeping Enslin in sharp focus while violently blurring the surrounding environment, the lens algorithms perfectly mimic his shrinking cognitive perimeter. Conversely, when the room projects its massive, oceanic disaster sequence, the visual engineering embraces absolute kinetic chaos, utilizing wide lenses to capture the overwhelming scale of the aquatic flooding as it violently breaches the physical architecture of the room. The water itself is lit to appear dark, heavy, and impenetrable, an ocean of repressed grief that physically fills the frame and threatens to entirely drown the protagonist's remaining cognitive bandwidth. When the room weaponizes the historical paintings, the visual effects team executed a brilliant structural pivot, utilizing advanced fluid simulations and digital compositing to allow the chaotic, two-dimensional maritime disaster to seamlessly breach the three-dimensional physical space. The integration of visual effects, both practical and digital, is handled with a sophisticated understanding of ROI. Rather than relying purely on expensive CGI that ages poorly, the production invested heavily in practical, in-camera physics. The physical tilting of the set, the sudden collapsing of walls, and the explosive shattering of glass were captured entirely in camera, providing a tactile, undeniable kinetic weight to the destruction that digital rendering simply cannot replicate. When digital augmentation was necessary, such as the projection of the ghostly stakeholders leaping from the window or the seamless deletion of the exterior architecture during the ledge sequence, it was utilized strictly to enhance the practical reality, not replace it. The ledge sequence is a triumph of visual tension, utilizing extreme, deep-focus high-angle shots to exaggerate the terrifying verticality of the urban abyss, mathematically increasing the perceived kinetic risk of Enslin's precarious physical position. The camera essentially weaponizes gravity, positioning the viewer directly over the edge, forcing them to process the exact same terrifying spatial data that is currently overwhelming Enslin's vestibular system. The execution of the doppelganger sequence across the urban chasm required precise motion control camera rigs, ensuring that the visual replication of Enslin's desperate movements was mathematically perfect, creating a flawless, terrifying mirror of his own failing physical equity. The transition of the clock interface, from a standard digital readout to an aggressive, 60-minute countdown, was treated as a high-priority visual asset, frequently cutting to macro photography of the glowing red digits to reinforce the absolute scarcity of his remaining temporal capital. One of the most brilliant pieces of visual engineering occurs during the false escape sequence, where the cinematography aggressively reverts to the bright, diffuse, sun-drenched aesthetic of a California beach. This sudden injection of high-key lighting and warm, saturated color represents an artificial market recovery, a visual deepfake designed entirely to convince both Enslin and the audience that the localized nightmare has concluded. The visual language here is deliberately comforting, utilizing slow, sweeping camera movements and stable compositions to rebuild the illusion of safety, making the subsequent, violent transition back into the charred, frozen room mathematically more devastating. When the post-office reality tears away, the visual transition is achieved through a combination of rapid editing and aggressive digital compositing, a literal ripping of the visual fabric that exposes the bleak, high-contrast nightmare lurking underneath. In the film's final act, the room is depicted as a completely bankrupted asset, a burnt, destroyed wasteland illuminated only by the harsh, flickering orange light of localized fires and the cold, unyielding moonlight piercing through the broken windows. The cinematography in this phase is characterized by extreme high-contrast lighting, where Enslin is frequently silhouetted against the flames, visually reducing him to a mere shadow of his former self, an entity entirely consumed by the room's monopoly. Delham's use of deep shadows in this final phase ensures that the room's ultimate spatial geometry remains completely unknowable. The walls seem to recede into infinite darkness, proving that the room is no longer a physical space, but an endless psychological void. Even the dust particles floating in the shafts of light were meticulously engineered in post-production, adding a dense, suffocating texture to the air itself, visually confirming that the very atmosphere of the room was a toxic, depreciating asset. The camera frequently assumes the perspective of the room itself, high, objective angles looking down at the broken protagonist, or slow, predatory tracking shots that stalk him through the debris, establishing the room as the ultimate, undefeated corporate entity. Every lens choice, every lighting cue, and every framing decision in 1408 is a calculated investment designed to systematically dismantle the viewer's visual comfort zone, mirroring the exact methodology the room uses against its primary victim. The visual engineering proves that true cinematic terror does not require monsters lurking in the dark, it merely requires the systematic, ruthless corruption of the light and space that we inherently trust to keep us safe. By treating the visual frame as a depreciating asset, the filmmakers successfully engineered a localized, inescapable nightmare, ensuring that the audience's optical processing centers were constantly under attack from the opening bell to the final liquidation. This concludes our audit of the film's cinematography and visual engineering, having mapped the exact physical and optical mechanisms utilized to capture the complete bankruptcy of Mike Enslin's reality. As we initiate our comprehensive audit of the auditory architecture and acoustic engineering deployed within 1408, we must recognize that the film's sound design is not merely a supplementary sensory layer, it is the primary vector of psychological liquidation. The acoustic environment of the film functions as a highly volatile, completely unregulated market, where the intelligence of the room actively weaponizes audio data to systematically bankrupt Mike Enslin's cognitive framework and emotional resilience. Before Enslin breaches the primary asset, the film establishes a stable, baseline acoustic ledger during his time in California and the bustling lobby of the Dolphin Hotel, characterized by the predictable, uncompressed hum of human commerce and standard environmental interactions. This baseline is violently disrupted the moment he steps off the elevator onto the 14th floor. The hallway represents a total acoustic vacuum, a sudden, terrifying absence of ambient noise that signifies a complete withdrawal of external market liquidity. The silence of the corridor is not peaceful, it is an oppressive, heavy dead zone that forces Enslin's auditory processing centers to strain, artificially inflating his baseline anxiety before he even engages the lock on the designated suite. Upon entering room 1408, the initial Foley work is meticulously engineered to execute a strategy of deceptive acoustic packaging, emphasizing the hyper-realistic, mundane sounds of standard hospitality infrastructure to lull his analytical defenses. The heavy click of the brass key, the hum of the mini-fridge, and the running water in the sink are mixed with extreme clarity, providing Enslin with a false sense of auditory control and verifying his illusion of absolute environmental stability. However, the room initiates its hostile acoustic takeover through the sudden, unauthorized activation of the clock radio, blaring the Carpenter's track, "We've Only Just Begun," a saccharine pop song instantly transformed into a terrifying corporate anthem of impending doom. This specific musical asset is deployed not as background accompaniment, but as a blunt force psychological bludgeon. Its upbeat, optimistic lyrics ironically underscore the absolute, inescapable finality of the 60-minute liquidation cycle that has just commenced. The blaring radio forces a massive injection of auditory volatility into the room, obliterating Enslin's quiet, analytical workspace and instantly degrading his ability to process rational thought or formulate a coherent exit strategy. When Enslin attempts to physically neutralize the radio, the music abruptly cuts to a blast of aggressive, high-frequency static, a harsh acoustic market shock that physically assaults the viewer's eardrums and signals the total corruption of the room's analog infrastructure. The sound designers systematically transform the physical architecture of the room into a living, breathing, and highly predatory acoustic organism, utilizing the structural groans of the walls and the knocking of the plumbing to simulate the sounds of a massive beast preparing to digest its prey. As the environmental parameters violently destabilize, the Foley team engineers entirely new, terrifying soundscapes for each phase of the room's assault, turning standard hotel utilities into localized acoustic nightmares. During the sub-zero thermal shock sequence, the soundscape is dominated by the howling, relentless shriek of the weaponized HVAC system and the sharp, microscopic cracking of ice forming on the furniture, sonically isolating Enslin within a freezing, hostile ledger. Conversely, when the maritime disaster breaches the two-dimensional artwork, the audio mix explodes into a chaotic, overwhelming roar of oceanic flooding, utilizing heavy low-frequency effects to simulate the massive, structural weight of thousands of gallons of crashing water. The acoustic engineering during the exterior ledge-walking sequence perfectly captures the terrifying spatial geometry of the urban abyss. The roaring wind of Manhattan is mixed to sound vast and indifferent, emphasizing Enslin's absolute insignificance within the macroeconomic scale of the city. One of the most devastating acoustic strategies deployed by the room is the targeted manipulation of Enslin's proprietary data capture hardware, his analog microcassette recorder. When he attempts to review his own auditory ledger, the playback is violently corrupted, presenting a distorted, impossible dialogue that proves the room has achieved total administrative access over his localized technology and his historical timeline. The room also utilizes severe sensory deprivation as a mechanism for market disruption, suddenly plunging Enslin into absolute, terrifying deafness, a complete crash of his acoustic bandwidth that leaves him entirely vulnerable to unseen kinetic threats. This sudden subtraction of auditory data forces his neurological systems into a state of sheer panic. The deafening, high-pitched ringing of severe tinnitus acts as the only remaining audio signal, a physiological alarm bell warning of imminent systemic collapse. When his hearing violently returns, it is accompanied by the deafening roar of a phantom television, blasting fractured audio that aggressively overloads his sensory processors and prevents any logical stabilization of his immediate environment. We must also audit the terrifying vocal performances integrated into the sound design, specifically the synthetic, heavily modulated voice of the automated front desk operator that Enslin reaches via the rotary phone. This voice functions as the ultimate, unfeeling corporate firewall. It is polite, algorithmic, and entirely devoid of human empathy, calmly ignoring his desperate demands for physical extraction and instead offering horrific, automated room service options. The operator's detached tone perfectly encapsulates the room's sociopathic business model, treating Enslin's agonizing psychological deterioration as a standard, predictable consumer transaction within its localized monopoly. However, the most catastrophic acoustic weapons in the room's inventory are the hyper-targeted auditory hallucinations of Enslin's deceased family members, specifically the voices of his father and his daughter, Katie. The room deploys these auditory deepfakes with surgical precision, bypassing his cynical armor to strike directly at his core emotional liabilities, forcing him to listen to the agonizing, localized echoes of his own unresolved historical guilt. Hearing Katie's voice calling out to him from the frozen wasteland of the bathroom represents the ultimate extraction of his emotional capital. It is a sound that completely liquidates his rational defenses and forces a total psychological surrender. The musical score, composed by Gabriel Yared, acts as the invisible macroeconomic current guiding this localized descent into madness, seamlessly blending classical orchestration with terrifying, modern acoustic dissonance. Yared's score does not rely on traditional, cheap jump-scare stingers. Instead, it utilizes sustained, atonal string arrangements and low, rumbling brass to create an atmosphere of continuous, inescapable psychological pressure. The music functions as a highly sensitive market indicator, swelling into chaotic, overwhelming crescendos during the room's aggressive physical assaults, and receding into mournful, isolated piano motifs to underscore Enslin's moments of profound emotional bankruptcy. During the highly deceptive, false escape sequence, the entire audio mix undergoes a massive, calculated recalibration. The claustrophobic, compressed acoustic environment of the hotel room is suddenly replaced by the expansive, wide-open, uncompressed soundscape of a California beach. The gentle crashing of ocean waves and the distant sounds of seagulls provide a massive injection of auditory relief, a false market recovery designed specifically to make the consumer's ears, and Enslin's brain, trust the newly established illusion of safety. When this false reality is violently revoked inside the post office, the sound design executes a brutal acoustic tearing effect. The ambient noise of the real world is literally ripped apart, violently plunging the mix back into the echoing, charred nightmare of 1408. In the film's final act, the room is presented as a completely liquidated asset, and the soundscape reflects this absolute desolation. The audio track is stripped down to the sparse, haunting crackle of localized fires and the hollow, freezing wind blowing through the shattered architecture. The spatial mixing of the film, specifically its aggressive use of 5.1 surround sound channels, ensures that the acoustic threats are never localized strictly to the front of the screen, but are constantly moving, circling, and stalking the viewer from the rear channels. This spatial audio architecture effectively traps the theatrical audience inside the same highly volatile, inescapable geometric perimeter as the protagonist, ensuring that the consumer physically feels the acoustic pressure of the room's monopoly. The ultimate validation of the film's acoustic data occurs in the denouement, when Enslin, having seemingly survived the liquidation process, plays back his salvaged cassette tape in the presence of his estranged wife. The emergence of Katie's voice from the analog speaker proves that the auditory trauma was not a localized hallucination, but a verifiable, terrifying external reality, permanently altering the historical ledger of the Enslin family. By treating sound as a dynamic, predatory entity rather than a passive background element, the filmmakers maximize their psychological ROI, proving that what we hear in the darkness is mathematically more terrifying than what we can actually see. This comprehensive evaluation of the film's auditory architecture concludes our analysis of the sensory mechanisms deployed to crash Mike Enslin's reality, perfectly preparing us to examine the macroeconomic marketing strategies used to sell this nightmare to the global public. The marketing strategy engineered by Dimension Films for the theatrical release of 1408 represents a masterclass in macroeconomic counterprogramming, strategically launching a highly contained psychological thriller into the highly volatile, heavily saturated summer blockbuster window of June 2007. Rather than directly competing for the exact same consumer capital as the massive, nine-figure franchise monoliths that traditionally dominate the summer ledger, such as the mechanized spectacle of Michael Bay's cinematic algorithms or established fantasy monopolies, the studio actively sought an entirely different demographic yield. The executive marketing board correctly identified a massive, unexploited vacuum in the adult and older teen consumer market, targeting stakeholders who were experiencing profound CGI fatigue and seeking a sophisticated, localized, and emotionally resonant return on their theatrical investment. Central to this demographic acquisition strategy was the aggressive leveraging of the film's primary intellectual property, the globally recognized, blue-chip brand equity of Stephen King, an author whose name functions as a highly reliable, risk-mitigating asset in the horror economy. By prominently displaying King's name across all primary promotional materials, the studio bypassed the expensive, time-consuming process of establishing a new, untested cinematic universe, instantly tapping into a vast, pre-existing consumer base with decades of established brand loyalty. This immediate brand recognition acted as a powerful consumer force multiplier, guaranteeing a baseline opening weekend box office yield and effectively lowering the overall barrier to entry for casual moviegoers who might otherwise ignore an independent, single-room psychological thriller. The visual architecture of the theatrical poster itself was a brilliant exercise in minimalist corporate branding. Rather than cluttering the physical real estate with chaotic action montages, it focused on the stark, imposing imagery of the vintage brass key and the ominous, blood-red numerical branding of the room itself. This minimalist aesthetic created a sense of artificial scarcity and intense mystery, forcing the consumer to actively seek out additional data regarding the product, rather than passively digesting a complete narrative summary from a single promotional asset. The casting of John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson provided the marketing department with two highly stable, premium human assets, allowing the promotional trailers to heavily feature rapid, high-stakes dialogue exchanges between established, bankable stars. Jackson's character, Gerald Olin, essentially functioned as the film's internal marketing director within the trailers, delivering the chilling, mathematically precise warning that no one has lasted more than an hour directly to the target audience. This specific line of dialogue was mathematically weaponized by the studio's editing bays. It established a rigid, terrifying timeline, selling the consumer not just a ghost story, but a highly concentrated, 60-minute endurance test with a guaranteed, rapidly approaching expiration date. Furthermore, the strategic pursuit and successful acquisition of a PG-13 rating from the Motion Picture Association of America completely altered the financial trajectory and total addressable market of the entire enterprise. By actively self-censoring gratuitous gore and heavily pivoting into bloodless, psychological trauma, the studio successfully bypassed the rigid age-gate restrictions that historically compressed the revenue ceilings of traditional, R-rated horror properties. This crucial regulatory compliance allowed the marketing campaign to heavily target the highly lucrative, high-frequency teenage demographic, ensuring that multiplexes could legally process ticket transactions from high school audiences during the highly profitable, peak summer evening windows. The television spot campaign was meticulously engineered to algorithmically target these specific demographics, purchasing commercial real estate during late-night programming and high-engagement sporting events to maximize the visibility of the product among young, thrill-seeking male consumers. The trailers deployed an aggressive, fast-paced editing rhythm, heavily utilizing the high-frequency acoustic shocks of the Carpenter's clock radio and the sudden, violent kinetic environmental shifts of the room to simulate the precise physiological arousal the consumer would experience in the theater. By refusing to reveal the true, macroeconomic scale of the room's psychological warfare, such as the maritime flooding, the sub-zero freezing, or the devastating false escape sequence, the marketing preserved the highest value visual assets for the actual point of sale. This deliberate withholding of critical narrative data is a highly sophisticated form of consumer manipulation. It promises high volatility without spoiling the exact mechanisms of the market crash, ensuring maximum impact upon initial viewing. The audience analytics generated during the opening weekend confirmed the absolute brilliance of this counter-programming strategy. The film achieved a massive, highly profitable domestic debut, proving that adult-oriented psychological horror could successfully strip market share away from summer tentpoles. Post-release consumer data, measured through CinemaScore and exit polling, revealed an incredibly strong word-of-mouth multiplier. The film's reliance on genuine emotional resonance and character-driven tension resulted in a surprisingly low week-to-week depreciation rate at the box office. Consumers were not merely reacting to the localized jump scares, they were actively engaging with Mike Enslin's profound emotional bankruptcy and his agonizing, scientifically impossible journey through the sunk cost fallacy of his own grief. This sustained, high-level consumer engagement allowed the film to continuously generate revenue long after the initial marketing spend had been entirely depleted, an essential metric for achieving the staggering $132 million global gross. The transition to the home video market in the fourth quarter of 2007 required a localized pivot in the overall marketing strategy, moving from broad theatrical acquisition to highly targeted, physical media capitalization. The DVD release was marketed entirely around the concept of narrative scarcity and artistic purity, heavily promoting the inclusion of the director's cut, which featured the original, uncompromising, and significantly darker ending. This strategy effectively monetized the studio's own internal boardroom conflicts. By advertising an ending that was deemed too psychologically devastating for the mass theatrical market, they created an irresistible, forbidden asset for the dedicated horror consumer. Consumers who had already executed a financial transaction for the theatrical release were heavily incentivized to execute a secondary, high-margin transaction simply to audit the alternate timeline and complete their understanding of the intellectual property. The DVD packaging utilized a completely different visual algorithm than the theatrical poster, heavily featuring the apocalyptic, frozen, and flooded destruction of the room, retroactively promising the extreme kinetic chaos that the theatrical campaign had carefully hidden. This dual-pronged visual strategy perfectly mapped the life cycle of the film. The theatrical run sold the mystery and the psychological tension, while the home video release sold the absolute, explosive destruction of the asset. In the modern, decentralized streaming economy, 1408 continues to demonstrate exceptional audience retention and algorithmic discovery, consistently appearing in curated psychological thriller playlists and generating steady, fractional digital dividends. The film's highly contained architecture and reliance on universally understood emotional currencies, such as isolation, regret, and the fear of the unknown, ensure that it remains a universally exportable commodity, completely insulated from cultural or temporal depreciation. When we formally audit the complete marketing apparatus deployed by Dimension Films, we observe a masterclass in treating a film not as a piece of art, but as a highly volatile, highly profitable financial instrument. The marketing team successfully utilized established brand equity, strategic regulatory compliance, and the psychological principles of artificial scarcity to manufacture a massive, undeniable consumer demand. They proved that in the ruthless, zero-sum economy of the summer box office, a well-engineered whisper of terror can successfully drown out the deafening, multi-million-dollar explosions of the competition. This comprehensive evaluation of the marketing strategy and audience analytics concludes our analysis of the macroeconomic forces that sold the film, leaving us perfectly positioned to examine the critical reception, award season impact, and the enduring, long-term legacy forecast of the picture. As we initiate our formal audit of the critical reception and long-term legacy forecast of 1408, we must first analyze how the independent market analysts of the cinematic ecosystem evaluated the asset upon its initial theatrical public offering in the summer of 2007. Historically, the critical establishment operates with a deeply entrenched, bearish bias against the horror genre, frequently downgrading these properties as highly disposable, low-yield consumer products devoid of genuine artistic or thematic equity. However, 1408 managed to successfully bypass this standard critical depreciation, securing a highly favorable consensus that recognized the film not as a cheap compilation of jump scares, but as a sophisticated, meticulously engineered engine of psychological warfare. When we examine the aggregate consumer and critical confidence indexes, specifically its robust performance on platforms like Rotten Tomatoes, where it achieved an approval rating hovering around 80%, we observe an anomalous, high-yield overperformance for a mid-tier summer thriller. The critical ledger overwhelmingly highlighted the massive individual return on human capital provided by John Cusack, recognizing his highly isolated, physically exhausting labor as the primary operational force driving the film's emotional and narrative ROI. Analysts correctly identified that Cusack was forced to act as a localized monopoly of audience attention, carrying the entire structural payload of the second and third acts without the standard safety net of a traditional ensemble cast or external dialogue partners. His ability to seamlessly transition the character from a state of arrogant, cynical detachment into a state of profound, pulverized emotional bankruptcy was lauded as a masterclass in behavioral degradation, providing the necessary human gravity to ground the impossible environmental physics. Furthermore, the executive leadership of director Michael Hafstrom was heavily praised for his rigid, highly disciplined spatial management, successfully converting a static, single-room architecture into a dynamic, highly volatile theater of psychological operations. Critics noted the brilliant logistical pacing of the film, applauding the deliberate, slow-burn amortization of Enslin's sanity during the first act, which mathematically ensured that the explosive, kinetic destruction of the final act carried maximum emotional impact. Positioned within the macroeconomic sector of Stephen King literary adaptations, a historically unstable market fraught with rapid creative bankruptcies and highly fluctuating quality control, 1408 immediately established itself as a premium, blue-chip asset. It successfully avoided the common pitfalls of the King adaptation pipeline, completely excising unnecessary secondary subplots and refusing to over-explain the supernatural mechanics, preserving the terrifying, unquantifiable ambiguity of the Room's corporate hostility. By refusing to provide a neat, empirical origin story for the Room's lethality, the filmmakers correctly identified that the fear of the unknown is an infinitely more valuable cinematic currency than the comfort of a rigidly defined mythological ledger. During the traditional, highly regulated fourth-quarter award season, the film was predictably ignored by the major prestige institutions, such as the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, reflecting the systemic rigidity of legacy boards that consistently undervalue the complex emotional mechanics of horror. The Academy's historical refusal to audit the specific physical and psychological toll required to manufacture a successful horror performance meant that Cusack's massive expenditure of labor went entirely unrecognized by the industry's highest-tier regulatory bodies. However, the asset successfully extracted localized dividends from specialized, niche regulatory committees, securing prominent nominations at the Saturn Awards and the Empire Awards, validating its absolute dominance within its specific, target demographic consumer sector. These genre-specific accolades function as vital indicators of long-term cultural retention, proving that the film successfully penetrated the core horror demographic and established a lasting foothold within the collective memory of the most dedicated consumer base. A critical component of the film's enduring analytical discourse is the deliberate manufacturing of multiple, conflicting timelines, specifically the profound thematic divergence between the theatrical survival ending and the director's cut liquidation ending. This structural anomaly essentially allowed the film to be audited twice by the critical establishment, evaluated on two completely different philosophical ledgers that drastically alter the final meaning of Enslin's psychological transaction. The theatrical ending, where Enslin survives and the audio tape validates his trauma, operates as an emotional market recovery. It allows the protagonist to escape the monopoly, carrying verifiable data back to the external world and repairing his fractured marital assets. Conversely, the director's cut ending, where Enslin perishes in the fire and his spirit remains permanently trapped within the burnt architecture, represents an absolute, unmitigated market crash, offering a bleak, uncompromising vision where the corporate entity of 1408 achieves total, permanent acquisition of his soul. The critical discourse surrounding these dual endings acts as a continuous, self-sustaining marketing mechanism, generating perpetual consumer engagement as audiences debate the varying levels of psychological devastation required for narrative satisfaction. Projecting the long-term legacy forecast of the film, we observe an intellectual property that has achieved an incredibly rare, depreciation-proof status within the modern, algorithmically driven streaming and digital syndication economy. Because the film's core terror relies on universal, macroeconomic human liabilities, specifically unresolved grief, profound isolation, and the terrifying sunk cost fallacy of regret, its emotional assets remain entirely liquid and immediately transferable to modern consumers. Unlike many mid-2000s blockbusters whose value was heavily tied to rapidly depreciating, early-generation CGI technology, 1408's reliance on practical, in-camera environmental destruction and intense psychological framing completely insulates it from technological obsolescence. The visual mechanics of a freezing room, a flooding hallway, and a man slowly losing his mind are timeless, kinetic investments that require no software updates to maintain their terrifying, high-yield efficacy. The film currently operates as a highly reliable, foundational asset within curated streaming portfolios, consistently generating fractional digital dividends and discovering new, younger consumer demographics through automated recommendation algorithms. It is frequently cited in academic and critical circles as the definitive blueprint for the contained thriller subgenre, providing a rigorous operational model for how to maximize tension and consumer engagement while aggressively suppressing logistical sprawl. When modern independent filmmakers study the economics of horror production, 1408 serves as the gold standard case study, proving that you do not need a sprawling cinematic universe to generate terror, you merely need a single room, a closed door, and an intimately understood character flaw to exploit. The cultural footprint of the film has even transcended the specific narrative itself, as Room 1408 has become a universally recognized, shorthand nomenclature for any environment that exudes a hostile, predatory, or inexplicably oppressive atmosphere. This total integration into the cultural lexicon is the ultimate validation of the film's brand equity, proving that it successfully mapped its localized nightmare directly onto the collective subconscious of the global market. In the final analysis of its critical ledger, the film stands as a monumental triumph of focused, ruthless storytelling, a narrative that effectively converted a tiny, confined architectural footprint into an expansive, terrifying exploration of the human condition. It proves that while the critical establishment may temporarily ignore the physiological impact of horror cinema, they cannot deny the long-term, compounding interest generated by a perfectly executed exploration of grief and terror. The legacy of 1408 is not defined by golden statues or prestigious institutional endorsements, but by its unyielding, continuous ability to trap viewers inside its psychological geometry, forcing every new audience to process the same agonizing transaction of hope and despair. We close this critical audit confirming that Dimension Films engineered a masterpiece of commercial and artistic harmony, a product that flawlessly balanced the demands of studio economics with the dark, unyielding vision of its literary origin. This comprehensive evaluation of the critical reception, award season impact, and enduring legacy forecast perfectly positions us to execute the final, synthesizing analysis of the film's overall harmony between art, technology, and capital. As we arrive at the absolute culmination of our comprehensive 13-step autopsy, we must synthesize the disparate data streams of 1408 to evaluate its ultimate standing as a masterpiece of art, technology, and capital harmony. The true brilliance of this cinematic asset lies not merely in its ability to generate localized jump scares, but in its flawless execution of a highly complex, multi-tiered corporate strategy that perfectly aligned creative vision with ruthless economic efficiency. At the core of its artistic ledger is a profound, unflinching audit of human grief, utilizing the supernatural genre as a Trojan horse to deliver a devastating exploration of isolation, regret, and the inescapable sunk cost fallacy of a shattered family. The narrative operates as a brutal, unforgiving mechanism of emotional extraction, forcing the protagonist, and by extension, the consumer, to confront the absolute bankruptcy of cynical detachment when faced with the raw, unquantifiable weight of historical trauma. John Cusack's performance represents a staggering expenditure of individual human capital, a highly leveraged, high-yield labor investment that anchors the entire impossible geometry of the film strictly within the recognizable bounds of agonizing human reality. His ability to physically and psychologically disintegrate on screen provides the necessary emotional equity to validate the room's existence, proving that the most terrifying special effect in the cinematic marketplace is the systematic dismantling of a rational mind. The artistry of the script is found in its refusal to offer easy, empirical answers. By maintaining the terrifying ambiguity of the room's origins, it preserves the integrity of the mystery, ensuring the asset never fully depreciates into mundane explanation. Transitioning from the creative to the technological, 1408 stands as a monument to the power of localized, highly concentrated practical engineering, proving that aggressive geographical containment can actually exponentially increase visual and kinetic volatility. The production team transformed a static, rigidly defined architectural footprint, a standard hotel suite, into a hyperdynamic, endlessly shifting theater of psychological operations, requiring massive, upfront investments in mechanical infrastructure. The deployment of advanced hydraulic gimbals, complex breakaway architecture, and massive, localized aquatic flooding protocols within the controlled environment of Pinewood Studios represents a triumph of physical, in-camera risk management. By prioritizing practical, tactile destruction over rapidly depreciating digital effects, the technological executives ensured that the visceral impact of the room's hostility would remain permanently liquid, completely insulated from the rapid obsolescence of early 2000s CGI. The acoustic engineering and sound design functioned as the primary, invisible vector of the room's hostile takeover, weaponizing the auditory bandwidth to completely destabilize the consumer's spatial awareness and simulate total neurological collapse. This deep, symbiotic relationship between the physical set design, the lighting architecture, and the spatial audio mix created a flawless, immersive simulation of madness, seamlessly translating the internal, abstract horror of the script into a tangible, physical threat. However, the most impressive achievement of 1408 is how perfectly this artistic vision and technological innovation were harnessed to execute a highly aggressive, incredibly lucrative capital deployment strategy. Operating within the highly efficient, risk-averse parameters of a $25 million mid-tier budget, Dimension Films manufactured an intellectual property that generated an astonishing $132 million in global theatrical revenue. This phenomenal return on investment was not an accident, it was the direct result of a meticulously calculated, macroeconomic counter-programming strategy that launched a sophisticated, adult-oriented thriller directly into the bloated, family-friendly summer blockbuster window. The executive board's decision to pursue a PG-13 rating functioned as a masterstroke of regulatory compliance, artificially expanding the total addressable market to include high-frequency teenage consumers without sacrificing the core, bloodless psychological terror of the primary asset. The acquisition and prominent deployment of the blue-chip Stephen King brand equity provided an immediate, universally recognized consumer trust metric, completely bypassing the expensive, high-risk process of establishing a new, untested horror franchise. By leveraging Samuel L. Jackson for highly concentrated, high-impact marketing materials, the studio created the illusion of a massive, star-studded ensemble while ruthlessly minimizing the actual, long-term payroll expenditure. The localization of the film's narrative to a single room mathematically eliminated the vast majority of unpredictable logistical variables, allowing the accounting department to maintain a rigid, highly predictable capital burn rate throughout principal photography. The subsequent monetization of the project's own internal boardroom conflicts, specifically the marketing of the darker, uncompromising director's cut in the secondary home video market, demonstrated a brilliant understanding of physical media capitalization and artificial narrative scarcity. When we view the film as a completely unified corporate entity, we see a machine that operates with sociopathic perfection. It algorithmically identifies the consumer's deepest emotional vulnerabilities and aggressively short-sells them for maximum theatrical profit. The room itself serves as the ultimate metaphor for the cinematic industry, an isolated, highly controlled environment that traps the subject, manipulates their reality, entirely dictates their sensory inputs, and ultimately demands a massive emotional transaction. 1408 proves that independent and mid-tier cinema does not need to compete with the nine-figure budgets of global franchise monopolies. It merely needs to execute its specific operational mandate with flawless, uncompromising precision. The harmonization of art, tech, and capital in this production is so absolute that it is impossible to extract one element without entirely bankrupting the remaining two. The grief necessitates the technology requires the capital, and the capital is justified by the universal resonance of the grief. It stands as a permanent, high-value asset within the historical ledger of the horror genre, a definitive case study in how to manufacture blockbuster-level anxiety within the cheapest, most spatially restrictive architectural footprint imaginable. As the final digital countdown reaches zero and the physical set is entirely liquidated by fire and ice, the film leaves its primary stakeholder, and its audience, completely divested of their cynical armor, entirely consumed by the profound, inescapable reality of their own isolation. The legacy of this localized nightmare is completely secure, destined to continue generating fractional terror dividends for decades to come, endlessly finding new consumers willing to check in, completely unaware of the massive psychological toll that will be extracted before checkout. We must respect the ruthless, unyielding efficiency of this cinematic enterprise, recognizing that Michael Hafstrom, John Cusack, and Dimension Films constructed a perfect, inescapable trap that flawlessly converted our collective human sorrow into undeniable, global financial success. This formally concludes our comprehensive, 13-step macroeconomic autopsy and psychological audit of 1408. The ledger is now closed, the assets have been fully evaluated, and the terrifying transaction is complete.